will be recorded, and then we'll send the link around to our internal colleagues afterwards. For our external colleagues, we're also going to upload this video, this recording, and also the previous ones to the CFAS YouTube channel under a restricted playlist, and then we'll be able to share the link that way. It's taken us a little while to figure this out, the best way to share it out, but that link can then be forwarded and remain accessible. So that's probably the best way to do that. So the format today, as with the other ones, is a 40-minute or so presentation followed by around 20 minutes of question and answers. But do also feel free to put questions and comments in the chat, and we'll keep monitoring that. Okay, so it's a pleasure for me to introduce our speaker for today, Gail Hurley. Thank you for joining us. She's a senior development finance expert specialising in the blue economy. She currently works part-time as a co-director of the Resilient and Sustainable Islands Initiative at ODI Global, and part-time on private consultancy work, including for UN agencies, World Bank Group, foundations and NGOs. She's held senior roles in Finance Earth and the United Nations Development Programme, where she worked extensively on innovative finance mechanisms for the blue economy. She's a recognised expert in financing challenges of small island developing states. Gail holds an MSc in Development Studies from the School of Oriental and African Studies, and has also studied economics at the University of London. And she holds a BA in French and Hispanic Studies from the University of Liverpool, and is currently based in Edinburgh in Scotland. So excellently placed to speak to us today on the topic, which is applied blue finance models, an ocean of opportunity or a drop in the ocean. So thank you very much for joining us, Gail. And yeah, we look forward to hearing what you have to say to us. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorna, for the kind introduction, and very good morning to all of you. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedules to join today's Blue Finance 101. On my long list of esteemed clients, Lorna, there's also CFAS, of course, and I'm very happy to be supporting the work of the SBE platform as well. So it's really nice to be here today. So I've been asked to speak about blue finance, and I hope this title captures what I want to say today. Applied blue, innovative blue finance models, an ocean of opportunity or a drop in the ocean. To what extent should we be excited about all the innovative blue finance mechanisms we're increasingly seeing on the market being developed? Or to what extent are they a drop in the ocean? And I think the key message I want to convey today is that, yes, there are many new opportunities out there to mobilize much needed finance for a sustainable ocean in creative new ways, and of course new technologies and the way we can collect data in more cost efficient and a timely and granular ways is only going to support continued growth of this sector and these financing mechanisms as well. But, and I think we probably all heard a but coming in there, many of these mechanisms are still a hard yard. Getting them over the line often still remains quite challenging, especially in contexts like small island developing states, where capacities might be smaller, market size smaller, economies of scale not necessarily able to be exploited there. And really, public finance through public budgets and public development aid support really remains essential in getting a lot of these new financing mechanisms over the line. So that is my starting point for today, that there is all this excitement there, but there is a bit of a caveat to all of that. So let me move on to my next slide. Why are we even interested in the whole suite of innovative blue finance mechanisms out there? Well, the backstory is, of course, that we know that levels of official development assistance, ODA, are so tiny when it comes to SDG 14 or the ocean, with just 2.2% in 2023. That's equivalent to about just 5 billion in US dollars out of a total ODA envelope of over 223 billion in that same year. And I think we all know that, unfortunately, while ocean aid has increased in recent years, albeit from a very low base, and it continues to be at a very low base, further declines in ODA are on the horizon across many countries. And so the situation with regard to ODA is unfortunately not bright at the moment. Domestically, public budgets in many countries are being squeezed by factors such as high debt, high energy costs, climate, and other shocks. And of course, nowhere is that more evident than in small island developing states, many of which are grappling with high debt ratios for a very long time now. And so hence we know that there's a large financing gap for SDG 14. The UN estimates that around 200 billion annually. I think that's actually way underestimated, and I would suggest it's much higher, but I don't have the evidence or the data to back that up. It's just a hunch. And so consequentially, there is a major focus on innovative instruments that can help to mobilize new capital for a sustainable ocean, in particular, leverage that capital from the private sector. And we're seeing a whole range of instruments being piloted, some of which are increasingly reaching maturity now. They're going beyond a pilot stage. And some that are still on the emerging side. And so I'll be going through some of these today and explaining a little bit about what they are, when they're suitable, when they can be used, and how they work, and then a case study for each of those as well, their practical application. So we'll be looking at things like thematic bonds, blue bonds, you've probably all heard of, green bonds, outcomes-based finance, risk mitigation tools, dedicated funds and facilities, things like blended finance and PPPs, and then debt swaps are some of the instruments that have come onto the scene and that I'll be looking at today. So the first is blue bonds, and there's a lot of excitement about blue bonds as a tool to finance blue projects that will make an economic return. So they're essentially debt issued to fund marine sustainability with a focus on infrastructure. They can be sovereign, sub-sovereign, or corporate. And of course, the funds mobilized via these bond issuances are tied to blue projects with measurable blue outcomes. These bonds can be also de-risked via guarantees or concessional finance, concessional grants from development partners in order to lower the interest rate on these bonds and make them more affordable and more attractive for private investors to want to invest in. And that's, for example, precisely the case with what happened in the Seychelles. They're an instrument which has seen significant growth. More growth is projected. They're modeled on green bonds, of course, but blue bonds a little bit more further behind that, but quickly gaining in speed. How they work is that bond investors provide the capital, the bond issuer, the sovereign state, invests that capital. Those blue projects are implemented. Then the bond issuer repays the bond with interest, and blue impacts are tracked and reported on to ensure that they're actually making a difference. So what kind of, oh, hang on a second, did I miss one? No. So I've put here a Fiji case study. They were one of the first small island developing states to issue a sovereign blue bond supported by UNDP, which helped develop the impact measurement framework. Actually, Fiji's blue bonds were quite interesting because some of they issued two types of blue bond, and one of them had a very low interest at just 1%. Whereas the other blue bond carried a more sort of commercial market rate of 4.2%. And crucially, it's not usually the case that you will get a significant discount on the interest rate with a blue bond issuance. This was fairly unusual. There was almost 9 million mobilized for projects, marine projects across 4 main areas: coastal protection, sustainable fisheries, waste management, and sustainable blue towns. And of course, ideally, these projects should make a financial return in order to repay the investors. Some of the challenges in terms of utilizing this mechanism in many small island developing states is that many do have high debt already. And so it's not likely to be suitable for all of them, even if there is a good set of projects in place that they could be used to finance. But crucially, these mechanisms, while they're the blue bond mechanism, while they're very useful to finance infrastructure, they do carry additional transaction costs relative to the so-called more vanilla regular bonds, because of course the sovereign state, usually via an independent third party, has to monitor, track, and report on the activities being financed and their impact that they're having. So those costs need to be factored into the cost benefit analysis of issuing an instrument like this relative to perhaps just going to market and issuing a regular bond. But governments often like good PR. It's good PR to highlight your sustainability credentials, that kind of thing, and maybe market to a broader set of investors, some of whom might be sustainability minded. Blue carbon is the next instrument I wanted to look at. Again, voluntary carbon markets have had a lot of publicity, both positive and negative, over recent years. Obviously, the market with regard to carbon is far more developed with regard to forest projects than it is to blue projects, such as mangroves or seagrass. But there are a lot of scientists, experts excited about the opportunity to leverage voluntary carbon markets for coastal and marine ecosystems such as mangroves, seagrasses, and salt marshes, because they capture and store even more carbon than terrestrial ecosystems. And those projects can earn carbon credits, which can be sold on voluntary markets to often corporate buyers who are interested in improving their market, their sustainability credentials, and offsetting their carbon footprint. Blue carbon credits, and if you bundle into your projects additional benefits like social or biodiversity uplifts as well. Sometimes those projects, the carbon credits, can be sold at a slightly higher rate than other regular projects. And revenue supports ecosystem preservation and community development. But of course, as is the challenge with blue carbon projects, robust data monitoring and verification are required to make a success of these projects, and especially when it comes to ecosystems like seagrasses, often that data availability is not there. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to have to speed up a little bit, but here's a study of a successful project in Kenya, which was one of the first, which was very nice because it involved local communities at the centre, and communities benefited from the carbon revenues from that, which is really important to factor into any blue carbon project. I think one of the challenges with these kinds of projects, aside from ensuring community consent, informed community consent and involvement, is the voluntary carbon markets price volatility, which means it can be quite difficult to plan revenue streams for these projects. High upfront development costs, the development of complex data and verification schemes and so on are also some of the challenges that need to be overcome when trying to put these kinds of projects into operation, and mean that it can often take several years from early stage conception and design to actually making a success of these blue carbon projects. Opportunity there, yes, but a hard yard. Debt for nature swaps. There's quite a lot of political momentum on debt for nature swaps at the moment, particularly in the marine conservation space. We've seen debt for nature swaps in Belize, in Barbados, Bahamas, Ecuador, several other countries recently focused on marine conservation. Under those, there are two types of debt swaps. So bilateral debt swaps, which are much simpler, in which case a bilateral creditor like Germany forgives the debt of its debtor in return for marine conservation investments. Very simple. A commercial debt swap, much more complicated, in which high cost debt is swapped for lower cost debt, helped by development partners such as multilateral development banks or bilateral development finance institutions who provide guarantees, and then the savings are directed into marine conservation trust funds. So these types of arrangement are typically supporting MPA financing. But the suitability, I've put a caution mark there, the suitability for debt swaps depends critically on the country's debt profile. Do you have high cost commercial debt that can be swapped for lower cost debt? You have to go through, like with a fine tooth comb, the debt profile, or do you have bilateral debt with a creditor who actually has an active debt swap program? So as you can see, Barbados was a recent successful case in point. It generated over 500 million in savings, which were able to be redirected over a period of 15 years into marine conservation savings. So basically, Credit Suisse and First Caribbean Bank arranged a new loan for Barbados. Development partners provided a guarantee for that new blue loan to Barbados. Barbados used that guarantee to purchase back its old debt at a reduced rate, issued new debt at a reduced rate thanks to the guarantee, with Barbados committing to redirect the savings from that operation to conservation over 15 years. So yeah, we can go into the structure in more detail if there's time later, but there's a lot of legal and advisory fees that come along with this kind of operation, which eat into the savings and again form part of the cost benefit analysis for these types of operations. Blended finance is another one where governments, particularly donors, are interested in funneling their aid into blended finance in the hopes that it will help to leverage and crowd in private capital to support blue growth. And so this is essentially the strategic use of donor and philanthropic money to mobilize larger volumes of commercial capital. And this is done by them providing guarantees or first loss positions in an investment. And that helps to de-risk the capital structure, and then private financiers are more likely to see that investment as a more attractive prospect from a risk-return profile. These have been typically used in green energy projects, and I think now there is a big push from NGOs, from developing country governments to actually go beyond energy and start to use blended finance structures in a wider set of operations. Small island developing states have often have not been big recipients of blended finance, in part because of the challenge of economies of scale. And so that's something I think we need to be thinking about. How can we work with small island developing states to catalyze more blended finance, but ensure that it's blended finance that responds to key principles of providing good value for money and funding SIDS development and infrastructure priorities, and making sure that there's a social benefit in there, that it's not just subsidizing the private sector to make investments that it would have done anyway. So the example here is of financing MPAs through blended finance, which it would be great to see more of in the nature-based space. I just encourage you to have a look maybe at Blue Alliance's website there and how they've blended public and private financing there to in a PPP model to fund MPAs there. I think there's just two more, and then we can stop for a chat. Impact bonds are the next one. Outcomes-based, also known as outcomes-based finance. So these are quite different from the blue bonds that I was talking about earlier. They're a financial mechanism focused on results. So at the outset, specific measurable outcomes are identified that the project will target. So in the blue economy space, they are things like reduced flood risk or improved water quality. Investors are then approached to provide the upfront capital for those interventions. The project is then implemented with that money, and the results independently monitored by an independent evaluator. And then finally, those initial investors are repaid by the government and or by donor partners, plus a small financial return once those pre-agreed results or outcomes are achieved. And investors lose their money if outcomes are not achieved. So this is essentially a model which shifts the risk of non-achievement of results to the private sector, away from the public sector. But as a result of that, the public sector, whether that's a donor partner or the national government, does pay a little bit extra for the project than it would have perhaps done ordinarily had it just financed that directly. The mechanism has not been widely used in the blue economy space, but there is a nice example from Washington, D.C. of their water environmental impact bond, by which they funded a lot of nature-based solutions across Washington, D.C. Rather than invest in hard infrastructure, they actually invest in green infrastructure to absorb a lot of water, reduced flood risk. That was successfully done in Washington, D.C. via this model, and then the investors were repaid. And sometimes these mechanisms can be structured so that investors receive a little bit more if the results surpass expectations, or they might be paid a little bit less if the results didn't quite come up to par. So there's different ways to structure these, but they can be a nice model. They've also been used in other environmental areas, like to reduce forest fire risk and things like that. So their suitability for nature-based solutions is definitely something to be on the lookout for. And then finally, we have blue impact investment funds, which again are something that we're seeing grow quite a lot. We had the Sustainable Ocean Fund, which was run by Mirova, And now we have something called the Outrigger Blue Impact Fund, which is going to be focused on SIDS specifically, which is sourcing a pipeline of projects. And basically, these blue impact investment funds are ways of aggregating multiple smaller blue economy projects into a larger fund and then selling that portfolio of projects to investors. It helps to overcome a couple of challenges which are quite prominent in the impact investing space. So it helps to overcome the challenge of small ticket size of the projects, especially in SIDS. Projects on their own might be too small to be interesting for investors to do their due diligence on. It's too much hard work. So if they can be aggregated, that is helpful. And obviously, if you have a broader set of projects under one umbrella, you're diversifying and reducing your risk exposure as well. So these are sold to investors who are seeking an impact alongside financial return to invest in the fund. And those investments that go into the Blue Fund are all screened according to the same eligibility criteria and aim to achieve certain blue outcomes. Impact funds sometimes, but not always, offer lower returns than conventional funds in exchange for impact. But that is definitely not something that can be taken for granted. I think the blue impact funds that we've seen to date have tended to aggregate projects across a broader set of countries. So they've included blue tech, blue infrastructure, that kind of thing, new technologies in aquaculture, and they've focused on both developed and developing countries. But what's quite exciting with the Outrigger Impact Fund is that this is going to be the first one focused exclusively on sourcing these kinds of investments in small island developing states, and hopefully that will move forward to raising investment next year. And that Outrigger Fund is part of sort of the Aura suite of initiatives. Blue impact investment funds, when are they suitable? Businesses which are an investable proposition, essentially, and less suitable for experimental or non-proven projects. Here's a comparative analysis of some of the advantages and challenges associated with the different instruments that I've outlined. And then to end my presentation, I just wanted to outline some lessons learned in terms of what we've seen across the various blue finance instruments to date, and what are some of our recommendations for the future, those of us who are working in this space. So the first lesson learned is that blended finance and technical assistance is often key to most successful projects. So this goes back to the very beginning about really the importance of public money, whether that's domestic public budgets or aid money, coming in to help design these mechanisms, provide capacity development support to bring the various actors up to speed, ensure that there's informed consent and community benefit for these projects. That all takes time and money. So in that sense, these are not things that can be done without preparation. And so that's where that public money and blended finance, philanthropy can play that role too, but obviously there's not as much of that as available as we would like. Second is around about data. It's really important that we know what impact these projects have if the private sector is to come in. And so we need more data. We need robust monitoring and evaluation, MRV systems. But I think this is great in we're in a great space here, because obviously with new technologies and new ways of collecting and disseminating data, I think this is only an area that is going to get easier. Capacity building for governments and local stakeholders essential. And I always say here that what's really important when we think about blue finance as well, it's not just about educating local communities or businesses on the blue finance opportunity. Actually, it's really important to bring entities like local banks, local commercial banks, local microfinance institutions with you on this journey. If you're going to be involving them in financing projects, often they don't have the skills or the knowledge to understand the blue economy opportunity, what the risks are associated with it, how they should be adapting their own financial products and services to be tailored to local circumstances. So educated and bringing the finance sector with you on this journey is going to be really important as well. And obviously long-term sustainability hinges on local ownership and benefit sharing. Who are we doing this for? It's for local people first and foremost, so they should be at the centre. Some of the recommendations is that national blue investment plans can help provide a vision and strategy for government to actually drive and set out priorities for sustainable blue growth in different areas, setting out what needs to be done, how that could be financed, who it will benefit, ensuring it's gender sensitive, that kind of thing. We need more money for all of the things that I was talking about. Getting these projects over the line requires more money. Sorry to have to say that. Strengthening ocean and coastal data. And there is a lot happening there. I'm involved in a nice blue economy project in ASEAN at the moment, and they are doing a mapping of the seagrass opportunity across 12 ASEAN countries at the moment, to really understand the potential for blue carbon in the ASEAN region. I was in Jakarta hearing from the marine scientists there last week, and that's quite exciting. So doing more of that kind of work will be really helpful as well. And then obviously I think there's a role for governments, for NGOs, for partners, for CFAS, for others to share best practices, promote peer-to-peer learning, etc. So I'll end there. I know I feel like that was a lot to take in, but I would be delighted to answer any questions you might have, and I look forward to your questions and your comments. Thank you. Shall I stop sharing? Would that be
Thank you, Gail.
helpful?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, if that's all right. Yeah. Thank you. There was a lot to take in, but you've done an excellent job of turning what is, in my mind anyway, a really complex subject into something that's quite accessible, like really clearly explained, and really useful to have the examples of where it's worked as well, but also an understanding of the reality of how it can be tricky. The comparisons table really, really helpful, and certainly those recommendations at the end, something that we can all take away. So yeah, I found that incredibly informative. So thank you very much. And we've had lots of questions. I'll go straight to Steve at the moment though, because he's got his hand up. So yeah, go for it, Steve.
I'm sorry, but I'm in the office, so I didn't actually have a camera with me, so I've turned it on now anyway. Thanks very much, Gail. Absolutely fantastic. Sort of whiz through financing, which is an extremely complex topic at the best of times. Now, I must admit, I personally struggled with all of this coming from a financing background, how we reconcile what traditional financing and bond financing and bond markets are when we compare them to what's happening now. And actually, the Seychelles bond we were involved with, we did some of the work on that, and I recall that that was actually credit wrapped by World Bank, which actually brought the credit rating to a point where investors would come in. But one of the things that I find quite difficult to sort of reconcile is that for investors, private investors to come in, there has to be some sort of return, unless it's a philanthropic or something like that. And even on the sort of blended finance you talk about, there has to be an outcome at the end of it. In other words, there has to be some sort of commercial onward move. There has to be a commercial, I suppose, project for it, for them to continue financing, because once debt is there, it has to be repaid one way or another. So how do you sort of see that developing in the future? Because a lot of the examples you gave are infrastructure projects, they're green finance, so they're wind farms, they're maybe power stations, they're woods, whatever, something that gives a financial income to the investor that they then know is a return and can technically repay the capital over the period of time that the project is running. That's not necessarily true of a lot of the blue finance projects that we see. So where do you see that moving in the future in terms of actually giving investors the I suppose the projects that will give them the cash flow returns that they need to actually turn this into what is probably a more commercial blue bond than currently what is a very much a grant or sort of government supported blue bond? Sorry, that's a long question and probably a bit technical, but you're definitely the person to answer it.
Thank you very much, Steve. Do we want to take a few questions, or do you want me to take a stab at that one?
I think if you're happy to take a stab at that, and then what I'll probably do is, if unless there are any other hands that come up, just work through the ones on the chat and ask people if they're happy to ask the questions that they posted.
Yeah, I'm trying to look at the chat at the same time.
You
so thank
might be
you
able
for
to
all
answer
the
Holly's
inputs.
wrapped up in that potentially, because that was about infrastructure.
Yeah. No, look, you're absolutely right, Steve, and I think that's where we're seeing the money go, right? It's where we're seeing the money go into infrastructure, sort of the harder infrastructure, like solar, like wind, like hydro, like wastewater and desalination. So these are the types of projects that are being financed predominantly by blue bond financing, by blended finance as well. It's an area where investors feel much more comfortable and confident. And I would say it's about the maturity curve here, because they feel much more confident about the risk return profile, more confident about the cash flow returns on hard infrastructure projects. Whereas along the maturity curve, nature-based solutions that Holly outlines in her question, so whether that's perhaps coral restoration, mangrove restoration, all of these kinds of interventions in your resilience that will help to boost your resilience, there's a lot less confidence in there, and investments in for-profit investments in nature-based solutions are far behind where we perhaps would want them to be. And I would say that we're still very much looking at quite some years before we turn isolated successes into something much bigger and scalable. And I think that the challenge with some of these nature-based projects is that they're also considered higher risk for investors. So if you're investing in a solar farm, you pretty much know what that looks like. In a SID, yes, you can experience hurricane damage or whatever, but when it comes to perhaps investing in mangrove restoration or coral restoration, trying to get a return from that through carbon, or selling the resilience benefits to local hotels or local other companies that might benefit from the resilience gains, there's still a lot of potential for those projects still to fail because it takes a long time for them to for coral to regenerate. There's a lot of vulnerability to disease or climate change. Mangroves also would take a longer time for the project to actually come to fruition, and potential for those projects to be perhaps interrupted along the way. So I think they all come into play, right, with regard to what we're seeing investors interested in and less interested in. So investors are interested in traditional infrastructure, but with a sustainable bent, and then financing the businesses that the blue economy businesses that are also trying to do things more sustainably. I don't know if that answers your question.
I think, yeah, of course, yes, it does, Gail. I mean, it's very much my thinking. I mean, I would just add a comment, and then I'll let others come in. Is that I think where our place in this current sort of where we are in the sort of journey, as you say, the sort of risk return sort of curve, is more about, I think, being that first loss. And I hate to use that word because, you know, that goes completely against my previous banking sort of life. But I think it's that bringing in that funding, maybe it's ODA or it's whatever, a grant aid funding, which actually is that initial part that creates the perhaps not inward investment, but creates the opportunity to start to do the work to develop the programs going forward. So, you know, it's almost seed funding type of thing, which then potentially could bring it in. But we do need to have a view on turning some of these programs and projects into something that actually have an outcome, and maybe that outcome that can be just be outcomes in terms of benefits to communities and stuff like that. But it is challenging, and I know that you've done some really interesting work in Antigua and Barbuda on this as well. But anyway, thank you very much appreciated.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, I'm always happy to talk about our work in Antigua and Barbuda as well. We worked with small farmers there to develop a blended finance facility that would help them to access financing to grow their businesses there. So I can share the link to the project report on that. If anyone's interested, they can take a look. I'm just looking at the questions here. I'm not seeing anyone's hand up, but I saw Peter ask about why would a nation choose a blue bond over a standard bond if they're not going to get a favourable rate. And I think oftentimes governments don't, right? That's why the market is still smaller than perhaps where we would want it to be, because if you're not going to get a favourable rate, why do it? And you can just use the money you would get on an ordinary bond for broader fiscal deficit financing, which is what governments often tend to do. But blue bonds are happening, I think, because governments do want to show their sustainability credentials to the international community, and also because they can show. I mean, in Fiji, they did get a more favourable rate in some of their bond issuance at just 1%. So yeah, I mean, there can be a variety of reasons. I mean, it's also about presenting it to your people about, well, this is the pipeline of projects that we're going to identify and finance, and then sort of showcasing that.
There are a few others from. I think you've probably answered Holly's first one, I would say, and potentially Freya's in your answer to Steve's. Peter had a few others. I don't know if you want to come on and ask them, Peter, or we can work through the chat questions.
Yep, I'm just having a look through.
Hi, yeah, sorry, just trying to find my unmute button. The other one, and I think you answered part of it, was around the use of the role of monitoring. Because quite often the monitoring infrastructure can be quite fragmented. Data is not shared. It's not efficient. It limits the ability for the partners to analyze that data. It limits their ability to invest in the skill sets to analyze that data because, you know, it's stored in an Excel spreadsheet here and there. And you kind of answered that by, I think, underscoring the importance of that, if I can say. But I just wondered if there are any studies that kind of quantified that you're aware of, that have investigated just how much benefit, or is it still quite a qualitative area?
Yeah, so what are the benefits of this monitoring data? Yeah, I'm not sure I understood the question in full.
Are there any studies that have looked at the role that environmental monitoring, the data that generates, provides benefits to the models that you've outlined? Because by, for example, providing metrics to measure against those models, which you said was quite important, to kind of assess whether or not those models are actually working. And I just wondered if someone's actually looked at that in more detail and said, versus a no data situation or versus a data poor event compared to high quality metrics, the advantages were X, Y, Z sort of thing.
Yeah, I'm not sure, to be honest. I think it would be an important area of inquiry. I mean, a lot of the data work we see is to establish a baseline against which the impact of the blue projects can be assessed, and then obviously put in place whatever monitoring mechanisms are required to report against that baseline. I think there's also a lot happening, not just on the impact side, but the understanding of the risk. It's also, I mean, I talked earlier about how private investors might be attracted to more the blue infrastructure projects because they understand them. They think of the risks as being lower, whereas the nature-based solution projects, the risks are thought of as or perceived as being higher. So they may be less likely to come in. So using data to actually understand what the risks are, as well as the impacts are of those different projects, and really get a more granular understanding, I think would be important to help drive these markets further in the future. But I don't know if that answers your question.
I think it does.
A lot of these are early stage. They're still very much under development, right?
Yeah, I mean, because in the work I'm doing in Belize, we're trying to build that infrastructure up, and it's becoming quite clear that there's a need for that integrated data picture. And so this just is a very interesting aspect that I didn't really think about before. So it's an interesting argument, almost to kind of not de-risk, but inform those decisions much more. So if a country is invested in that versus one that doesn't, the country that has is more likely to do it. And the last question, and maybe we can share this after, is if you know anyone that's operating in this area that's doing that you like the work of, then please do kind of provide contacts. But yeah, that's it for me. Thank you.
Absolutely. No, definitely. I think, the data, we tend to think of more data as being really positive. I mean, just to turn this on its head, Peter, investing more in the data collection, and we tend to think of that as automatically a positive thing. But if you're trying to leverage the private investment, maybe it's not, because maybe if you're showing that actually the risks are even more accentuated than you initially thought they were, then obviously a private investor is never going to come in. And then maybe that's okay. Maybe you just say, okay, well, this risk setting is so high with regard to this environmental intervention or whatever it might be, that therefore the only solution is traditional public financing. I think that's an important finding. So using that data to actually therefore inform the most suitable financing arrangements, and the extent to which there really is potential or not, according to the data, for a private finance provider to come in, can at least help to inform your decisions about which avenues to pursue.
Great, thanks. That's brilliant.
I feel like Holly might want to ask a question. Her hand's been up and down a bit.
Oh,
And
sorry,
you've got good
Holly.
questions on there, Holly.
Sorry, Holly.
No, it's not. I was doing that on purpose. I had a question and then you answered it, and then I had a follow-up question, and then I doubted myself. And yeah, I think it's just, I think it's just an interesting discussion to be had, and it doesn't sound like there's clear answers for anything in a way, because my thought is, we've been talking about how hard infrastructure is maybe less risky than green infrastructure, but actually, is that the case in the long term? Like, do we actually have that kind of, I know we talk about returns, but often I think it sounds like, they're looking for quick returns and clear things like that, where actually there has been evidence that shows that, maintaining sand dunes is going to have it's lower cost, and it's going to have a better actually return in the future, having mangroves, those kind of things. So I guess it's about, and that kind of goes, it all ties in, it kind of ties into what Pete was saying about data is, do we actually have the data to show these types of returns and risks and risk-based benefits analyses? And I think not a lot of the countries do. And, for example, I see some people here on the call who have kind of looked at the Senegal kind of landscape around coastal erosion and how bad the coastal erosion is there. And if you're investing in all of these kind of energy infrastructure and hard infrastructure and things like that, it looks like things are better, but actually, is it benefiting the coastal erosion? One, they don't have any data to tell you because they're not monitoring the data. And two, are we looking long term enough? It is very, sorry, not very well articulated, but I think it's just all of our questions are kind of coming in together. Yeah.
And I think, sorry, just to sort of tie that into your other question, Holly, about where do you, Gail, see us as an organisation sort of contributing the most within all the bits that we've been talking about? What's the best thing that we can do you think?
That's a $1 million question, Lorna.
Tell us how to access the money. Where do we fit into this whole scheme?
Yeah.
Look, a couple of comments. I think, Holly, you're absolutely right. It's what we call like a finance mismatch often, but that some investors want a quicker and higher return, and hence the sort of the preponderance for sort of the more traditional sustainable infrastructure type investments and route, and sort of the more blue economy businesses, fisheries, aquaculture, that kind of thing, that are attracting maybe the financing. Whereas you said, well, actually, we could have a higher impact if we did sand dunes or some other nature-based solutions, and it's cheaper and it's over a longer time frame. But some investors are not going to touch that with a barge pole. So we just know that. And this is why there's some interesting conversations about how, therefore, can we educate and bring on board perhaps those investors that do have a much longer term time horizon, maybe the pension funds, maybe sovereign wealth funds. There are some investors perhaps that have not been venturing in these directions, but could perhaps have an interest. So it's about matching the finance provider, each of which has different constraints and limitations on what they do, and their motivations, with perhaps those with different types of projects. So I think that there can be much more matchmaking being done. And I think for CFAS, what's really important, I think, is, we're talking, when we're crowding in private capital, we're still talking about the profit motive being there above all else, usually above all else, even those that are impact oriented, which is a smaller sliver. of the investor market still want that reliable financial return. And so it's really important for those of us who are involved in international development to educate and talk with the investment community about how to ensure things like community benefit, the maximum possible biodiversity uplift, things like gender sensitive approaches, all of these kinds of things, because that's not necessarily something that's going to perhaps be forefront in their mind, but make sure that as these markets grow, that they're done in ways that will be impactful for both people and planet. I hope that doesn't sound too wishy-washy, but Steve, you have your hand up again.
Can I just a very, very quick comment? Gail, what's your view on sort of blended impact funds? So you could imagine that you'd have a fund that had a combination of sort of these infrastructure projects, which would give a hard return, and then a number of projects that maybe are looking at nature-based solutions. So overall, individually, you wouldn't invest in them, but if you created a fund, they would give a blended return, presumably, which would mostly come from the infrastructure projects that may well be attractive to investors. So the investors would be investing in the fund, which would then have a blended investment portfolio, but all of it would necessarily be in the hard sort of infrastructure. Are we starting to see that sort of thing develop?
Yes, we are. We saw that with the Sustainable Ocean Fund that was run by Moreover, that had a couple of nature-based MPA projects in there, but the majority was associated with fisheries. Outrigger is now growing its project pipeline, presumably to do a fundraise round, its first fundraising round next year. What I would say that I think that's a great approach, and I hope we do see more of it. But it's always about the weighting within the overall portfolio. So until there's enough confidence in this market, then by definition, you're always going to be talking about a lower proportion of those nature-based projects within the overall portfolio. And so is that going to achieve the scale that we all want to see, or do we need to pursue other strategies in parallel? I would say yes, we do. But in terms of helping to grow confidence in the market and show that these projects can come into a fund, and especially if they deliver, then that over time will be helpful.
Great. Thank you very much, Gail.
That's great. Thank you, Gail. We have come to the end of the time. There are a couple of other questions. I don't know if you've got time to answer those, or we can leave them.
I've got pollution events.
Sorry, yeah.
I don't know. Does Andy want to come in, or
Ask that one, Andy.
I can give it a whirl. It was trying to understand where we bring value that investors might be interested in, because otherwise I can't really see what we do that delivers the opportunity for profit. And I was just wondering whether there was any mileage in the work that we do and encourage and train people to do in terms of understanding what their environment looks like now, so that in the event of some sort of environmental catastrophe, whether it's a cyclone, an oil spill, whatever, that there is more data available, which makes the insurance wrangling slightly easier, might lead to a quicker result. So I just don't know. I was wondering whether that was an angle that we might be able to exploit as a marketable benefit.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I meant to put insurance in this portfolio, this suite of finance instrument. I'm so sorry that I didn't do so. The two areas where insurance is growing in the blue finance space are sort of the parametric insurance for sovereigns. So if a hurricane, cyclone strikes, they can get money quickly. And the other area, which is less well developed and I think is struggling a little bit, is sort of the blue insurance for fishers. that if they're fishing more sustainably and looking after their natural environment, then they can secure lower premiums on their insurance, and then if there is some kind of economic shock or environmental shock, those fishers can be their income is assured for a period of time. So I think for insurance companies, I mean, look, there's a lot of interest in this area from the insurance sector. AXA's been doing a lot of work in pioneering different types of insurance. So I think to the extent that there's more data available on the impact of these and how they might impact on sort of risk, and then that would be a big benefit. So I definitely think it's an area of growth.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, we have reached the end, so I think we might have to call it there. If the questions, I might just keep going. But it's great to see so much interaction from people, and obviously goes to show how important this topic is to all of us. So thank you so much for taking the time both to prepare the presentation, which it was really clearly delivered, and also then to come and give it to us and answer all the questions.
Of course, feel free to reach out, anyone. I know there's not enough to cover. There's not enough time to cover everything, but just yell if you want to chat.
Lovely. Thank you very much, and we'll get this recording up and accessible to everybody else as well. So thank you, Gail. That's really helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks,
Thanks for
Bye.
joining. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.